Hi there, Mrs. Vance again. We are starting on Unit 11 now, which is about evolution. This is the first part of Notes about Evolution. We're going to talk about what the evolution means and a little bit about Darwin and how Darwin came up with his theory and what the main points of the theory are. And then later on we'll get into some things about the finer points about what happens in evolutionary processes. The big thing to understand is that evolution is the way that the organisms that we have today have descended from ancient organisms. There are ancient organisms that might have been similar, or maybe not, but over time there have been changes in those populations of those organisms that have led to the species that we have alive today. As usual, lots of vocabulary in this unit. A lot of this vocabulary will be new. None of it is very difficult. It's just new concepts for you that you probably haven't learned a whole lot about in the past. So Charles Darwin, as you know, was an English naturalist. What you may not know is he was descended from a very wealthy family. He was able, after he finished college, to go on a mapping voyage on the HMS Beagle. Their original task was to map the coast of South America. And so they traveled across the ocean to South America, all around the continent of South America, taking mapping measurements. They didn't have GPS back in the day. They didn't have drones or satellites to look at the outline of the continents. They had to do it by taking measurements of latitude and longitude and actually drawing out the maps. So it was kind of an arduous process. The voyage was supposed to take a couple of years. It ended up taking 5 years, and they ended up going all the way around the world. After they went around South America, as you can see in the map on the next in this slide, they went back and forth around South America, and then hit the Galapagos Islands, then across the Pacific to Australia and New Zealand. And across the Indian Ocean to the Cape of Good Hope, back to South America, and then all the way back up to England again. And so it was a pretty extensive voyage, lots of stops along the way. One thing that Darwin wasn't totally aware of when he left on this journey was he was very prone to seasickness, and so he spent a lot of his time on board the ship not feeling very well at all. And so when they got to South America, there were various periods of time when they were doing their mapping measurements. He would tell the captain, "Why don't you just leave me here and pick me up, at this next location down the coast, and I'll go overland and make observations and collect specimens and things like that." And so he spent more time, especially around South America, on land, going overland, than he did on the ship. And I know he was very happy about that, because he was not a good traveler on a ship because of seasickness. So he came up with some theories over time, and once he got back to England and started looking at all the specimens he had collected and compiling his notebooks together, he came up with some ideas about how species that are alive today had descended from ancient species. And so he came up, the big thing about Darwin, other people had had this idea before, but he's the one that came up with a mechanism by which it could happen. So here are the points of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. First of all, there is variety in populations, and the variety in the population seems to be inherited. You can see when you look at offspring of parents, you can see some similarities and a few differences here and there. And as we know from learning a little bit about genetics, that definitely those things can be inherited. So there is variety in the population, and the variety is inherited from parent to offspring. The other point that he noticed a lot about is that a lot of species overproduce their offspring. More offspring are produced than are able to survive. That means that there is a struggle for existence. The ones that they have to struggle for food, for space, for opportunity, things like that. And so there is definitely a struggle for existence. The big thing is that in that struggle, there are usually some individuals in a population that, because of the variation that they inherited from their parents, have advantages or disadvantages in that struggle for existence. The ones that have the variations that are helping them more, the most helpful or most advantageous variations are called the fittest. The ones that are fittest to survive are going to survive and reproduce and pass on those genes to their offspring, which leads to change in the population over time, which is what we call evolution. One of the big things to realize is that evolution does not happen to individuals. Okay. The selection occurs because of interactions, because of individual organisms, but the individuals don't evolve. It's the population or the group of organisms that evolves or changes over time because those traits that are best adapted become more common in the group, and other traits change or disappear. So the species alive today are the ones that are descended from the ancestral species with those modifications that occurred because of the mutations or the variations that occurred in their genes. We call those adaptations. The adaptations are the organism's traits that make it more successful in its environment. A big thing to remember also is that natural selection can only change traits that are inheritable. It can't change things that have been modified during the lifetime of the organism. It has to be in the genes of the gametes, and otherwise it can't be passed on to the next generation. And a third really important thing to say about evolution: it is not goal-directed. It is not leading to perfectly adapted organisms. It's only leading to ones that are adapted based on the traits that they have available to them. It's a result of environmental factors that can change from place to place and time to time. A trait that is favorable today in some situations may be disfavorable or useless or harmful in other circumstances. And so sometimes it's not a matter of developing a perfect way for something to happen. It's developing a way that seems to work better than something else or what was there before. So it's definitely important to understand those basics about evolution. So when we use the term natural selection, what is it that we mean by that? Well, let's look at the opposite of natural selection. We have things available to us today that have been developed through something called artificial selection. For instance, these vegetables that are shown here, kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, kohlrabi, are all descended from the same wild mustard plant that has been selected for different characteristics that the humans that were using them found advantageous. Okay, almost everything we eat is a result of artificial selection by farmers and ranchers and agronomists that have been working through years and years and years, thousands of years, to choose the plants with the traits that were most beneficial, choose the animals with the traits that were most helpful to them in order to make a profit. So artificial selection is definitely important. So to summarize natural selection, we've got inheritable variations that occur in individuals, and we have offspring that are over-reproduced. There are too many offspring in many species. And so we can infer from that, and this is what Darwin did, he inferred from that the individuals that were best suited to their environment tend to leave more offspring, and that over time those inheritable favorable traits would accumulate in the population, leading to change in the population over time. Now, it's tempting to assume that if there are things that we acquire in our lifetime, like special characteristics because of our occupation or things like that, it's tempting for us to think, well, can't we pass those on to our children? And that was very commonly thought back in the time before Darwin. Okay, and so a very famous scientist named Lamarck, who was well known for a lot of things, his idea was that evolution, or the change in species, was the product of the use or disuse of organs that were acquired by the organism or lost by the organism during their lifetime, and that these traits could be passed on to their offspring. But here's the thing. These things that are acquired that we do during our lifetime are not inherited. And so just because we cut off the tails of rats doesn't make their offspring be born tailless. It just means that the genes are still there to make the tail, and we didn't remove the genes, we just removed the tail. It's all down to what happens in the genes. Genetics is the key to all of understanding this. And that's the end of the first part of notes.